Hello and welcome. The subject of this video is Series 1200 of the IIA standards. Series 1200 covers proficiency and due professional care. This is constituent of the attribute standard and part of the mandatory guidance of the International Professional Practices Framework. This Series 1200 we will be covering in 3 videos. The first one is 1210 about proficiency, which is this video. The second one is 1220 due professional care, and the third one is on 1230, which is continuing professional development. So let's ask some intriguing questions from ourselves on 1210 proficiency. How internal auditors can demonstrate their proficiency? How chief audit executive should assess and manage proficiency of the internal auditors? If internal auditors are lacking in proficiency, what chief audit executive should do? When to decline the consulting engagements, and what's the relevance and utility of the IIA's global internal audit competency framework with the standard 1210, and on key IT risks and controls, and on the risk of fraud, what is the expectation from the internal auditor? So let's try to get answers to all these questions during the process of reviewing this standard in this video. Standard 1200 is the parent standard of this series. In this standard, IIA requires that the engagements must be performed with proficiency and due professional care. As per standard 1210 proficiency, IIA guides us on how an internal auditor and the internal audit activity demonstrate the attribute of proficiency. As per standard, the internal auditors must possess the knowledge, skills and competence needed to perform their responsibilities or their individual responsibilities. Similarly, from the internal audit activity, the IIA requires via this standard that the internal audit activity collectively must possess or obtain the knowledge, skills and competencies needed to perform its responsibilities. As we know from the standards requirement now that the proficiency is a collective term that refers to the knowledge, skills and other competencies required of the internal auditors to effectively carry out their professional responsibilities. The proficiency encompasses consideration of the current activities, the trends in the business and the profession, emerging issues within the organization and in the profession to enable relevant advice and recommendation. So it's about the internal auditor is keeping himself updated about the trends, about the current activities and about the emerging issues in the profession, as well as the subject which he is auditing actually. Now, in order to demonstrate how the internal auditors can demonstrate the proficiency is by getting a certification actually. So internal auditors should be encouraged by the chief audit executive and by the organization to demonstrate this by obtaining the appropriate certifications like the certified internal auditor offered by the Institute of Internal Auditors and other relevant certifications and designations offered by other bodies as well. So now we'll understand the requirement of assurance and consulting standards scoping around proficiency. Standard 1210 A1 for assurance It requires that the chief audit executive must obtain competent advice and assistance if the internal auditor is lacking or internal auditors are lacking in the knowledge, skills and other competencies which are required to perform all or part of the responsibilities and the engagements they are delivering. On the risk of fraud, the standard 1210A2 requires that the internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge to evaluate the risk of fraud and the manner in which it is managed by the organization. But there is an exception here, that the internal auditors are not expected to have the expertise of a person whose primary responsibility is detecting and investigating fraud. The third assurance standard is A3, which is about the key IT risk and controls. It requires that internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge of the key information technology risks and controls and available technology based audit techniques to perform their assigned task and assigned work. Now, however, not all the internal auditors are expected to have this expertise because this is the primary responsibility of the internal auditor who is looking after the IT auditing. On consulting engagements, the standard 1210 C1 requires that the chief audit executive must decline the consulting engagement or obtain competent advice and assistance if the internal auditors lack the knowledge, skills and other competencies needed to perform all or part of the engagements. So we need to keep in mind the three words, which is the knowledge, skills and competencies, that will go all along the line when we are talking about the proficiency. To achieve this standards conformance, it is essential that the internal auditors understand and apply the mandatory guidance of the IIA's International Professional Practices Framework and have certain knowledge, skills and competencies. Ensuring the collective proficiency of the internal audit activity is the overall responsibility of the chief audit executive, who must effectively manage the internal audit activity and its resources to accomplish the internal audit plan and add value to the organization. When we will discuss series 2000 of the standards, which addresses the details of the managing the internal audit activity and internal audit resources, we will discuss that. This is the series for performance standards, which will be having in the a discussion on in the later videos. Even though we are not discussing the IIA's global internal audit competency framework in this video, but this competency framework has a relevance here. The framework defines the core competencies needed to fulfill IPPF requirements for all occupational levels of the internal audit profession, like including staff, management and the executives. To conform with the standard 1210, the chief audit executive and the internal auditors, they should review and they should understand and reflect on the competencies that comprise of the competency framework, and that will be helpful in understanding the proficiency status and how to improve it. To build and maintain the proficiency of the internal audit activity, the chief audit executive may develop a competency assessment tool or a skills assessment, which can be based on the competency framework of IIA or maybe another framework, maybe the maturity model can be used. Then the chief audit executive could incorporate the basic criteria of the internal audit competency into the job description and recruitment material to help attract and hire the internal auditors with the desired or with the appropriate educational background and experience. The chief audit executive may also use the competency assessment tool to complete a periodic skills assessment of the internal audit activity for gap analysis. When doing so, the chief audit executive should consider those specialized risks, which is like risk of fraud or risk of information technology or cyber security, or maybe the available technology based audits, or maybe data analytics skill set within the department. So all these areas can be considered when defining that what the gap analysis, when considering the gap analysis, or when assessing the gap analysis. So these are like we reviewed the standard A2 and A3 guide us on the risk of IT and risk of fraud. So similarly, these specialized risks can be considered, and they can give you a good idea of what can be the gap, and that should be filled by the chief audit executive with the help of the board and audit committee. The chief audit executive has additional obligations related to ensuring the collective proficiency of the internal audit activity. These include managing the internal audit activity in conformance with the mandatory guidance of the IPPF, which we discussed before, that standard 2000 covers how to manage internal audit activity, which is the performance standard. We will be discussing in the later videos. And also this include to fulfill the internal audit activity, internal audit plan, by ensuring that the internal audit activity has the appropriate mix of the knowledge, skills and other competencies. You may refer to standard 2030, which is about the resource management, and we need to cover this in a later video. So we earlier understood that if the internal audit activity does not have appropriate and sufficient resources on staff, the chief audit executive is expected to obtain competent advice and assistance to fill any gaps. And then we also discussed that the chief auditor can use the criteria defined in the competency framework to identify gaps. So now we have identified the gap. What to do? Now that the internal audit, in this internal audit activity, collective proficiency is the target for the chief audit executive. So the chief audit executive need to develop plans for filling those coverage gaps through hiring, through the training, maybe outsourcing or co-sourcing, or maybe other methods can be used. We have standard 2050 which guides us on the respective implementation and guides us on the details of the coordinated activities or coordinating activities with other internal and external providers of services for assurance and consulting services. To enhance proficiency of the internal audit activity, the chief audit executive would encourage professional development of the internal auditors, whether that occurs through the on-job training, maybe attendance at the professional conferences, webinars, seminars, or maybe encouraging the pursuit of professional certifications like certified internal auditor. Also by regularly reviewing the performance of the internal auditors on those personal development plans. And chief audit executive may gain insight into the training needs, other training needs of the internal auditors, and provide feedback to help develop those individuals. So if we reiterate the requirement of this standard, which requires that individual internal auditors to possess the knowledge, skills and competencies needed to carry out their responsibilities effectively. So what individual internal auditor can do here? The individual may use the competency framework as a basis of self-assessment. Like they don't have to, individual auditor is not required to wait for the chief audit executive. He knows, every person knows himself very well what are the weak areas. So need to do the self-assessment himself using the competency framework. Moreover, the standard encourages the internal auditors to obtain the appropriate certifications, as we said before, to further support the professional growth and increase proficiency for both the internal auditors and the internal audit activity as a whole. Likewise, standard 1230, which is about continuous professional development, and third video of this series, that requires the internal auditors to enhance their competencies through continuing professional education and development. Internal auditors should keep themselves informed about the continuing education, new trends that may be required to maintain, for example, any professional certifications they hold. Because standard 1210 requires proficiency that encompasses the consideration of current activities, trends and emerging issues, continuing education could include opportunities to learn about the new trends and changes in the industry that may affect the organization. They may highlight the potential risk, and that may affect the internal audit profession, the way we are doing things. So Chief Audit Executive may help ensure that the internal audit activities overall proficiency is enhanced in this regard. For example, the Chief Audit Executive could subscribe to industry news services or maybe email or newsletters or some websites which are likely to include information about the recently published data or studies or some periodicals and white papers. The Chief Audit Executive may also help attend or recommend to the audit staff online or in-person seminars. Periodically, the Chief Audit may schedule the internal staff trainings, like events to introduce the new technology or changes in the internal audit practices, or if there are some frequent mistakes are coming from the internal auditors on handling certain issue or maybe on managing the working papers, so they or maybe managing timelines, so there can be some internal trainings on that as well. At the level of individual engagement, the Chief Audit Executive assumes overall responsibility for supervising the engagement to ensure quality, achievement of objectives and staff development. The engagement supervision is covered in Standard 2340. The proficiency and experience of internal auditors help determine the extent of supervision requires. For example, if there is an experienced auditor, definitely the Chief Audit Executive will be spending less time on the supervision because that guy will be more independent and self-sufficient. To stay informed, the Chief Audit Executive may periodically assesses the skills of individual internal auditors. Also, as an engagement is completed, the Chief Audit Executive or an engagement supervisor may survey and or interview the engagement client, which is ideally should be formally, to solicit the feedback about the internal auditor's proficiency in performing the engagement. The individual responsibilities of internal auditors at the level of engagement planning include considering the appropriateness and sufficiency of resources to achieve engagement objectives. This is covered in Standard 2230, which is engagement resource allocation. The internal auditors usually review the objectives and scope of audit engagements and then discuss with the Chief Audit Executive any limitations in their competencies that might prevent them from achieving those engagement objectives. And this is the right time at the outset when they are understanding the objective and scope, and the right time to discuss and highlight such limitations. So, how to demonstrate conformance? For the individual internal auditors, the evidence that can be kept for their proficiency will be through their resumes or CVs, by maintaining records of certifications and the continuous professional development, for example, courses, maybe credit hours they've obtained, participation in the conferences, workshops, seminars, webinars, performance reviews. The Chief Audit Executive or an audit engagement manager or supervisor may retain records of their evaluation of individual internal auditors and the internal audit activity as a whole. Such evaluations may include individual performance reviews, post-engagement discussions, memos, minutes of the meetings, and the documented feedback from post-engagement client surveys, as well as the interviews that may also evidence the proficiency of the internal audit activity the individual internal auditors, or both. Any of the other documents which can show the evidence of the conformance of internal audit activity may include the internal audit plan that includes an analysis of the resource requirement, an inventory of available audit staff skills or individual profiles listing the qualifications, an assurance map with a list of qualifications of service providers on which the internal audit activity relies on, and the documented results of the internal assessments. The ultimate goal of the chief audit executives and all the endeavors which he made is to establish and maintain a proficient internal audit activity at the end. And this can be demonstrated through the use of competency assessment tool and the development of the internal audit policies, procedures and training materials, and the efforts to recruit and hire proficient internal auditors may be reflected in the job descriptions or other recruitment material. So concluding, let's have an overall review of what we have completed and completely reviewed is the proficiency and professional due care and due professional care, which is the standard 1200 series. In proficiency, which is 1210, which is the subject of this video, we reviewed that the engagement must be performed with proficiency and due professional care, which is standard 1200, and 1210, which is proficiency, which requires the internal auditors and internal audit activity that they must possess the knowledge, skills and other competencies needed to perform their individual responsibilities. If the internal auditors are lacking in proficiency, then chief audit executive should obtain competent advice and assistance. The internal auditors must have sufficient knowledge of fraud and IT risk, but we know that they don't need to have the knowledge to that level which is required from the specialist person who is responsible for this area. The relevance of IIA's global internal audit competency framework in utilizing this framework to set the criteria for competency that we discussed. The competency assessment tool, which it was required from the standard that chief audit executive should develop to build and maintain the proficiency of the internal audit activity and the individual internal auditors. The chief audit executive's additional obligation we discuss about, for example, the professional development of staff and how to demonstrate the conformance of this standard. So thank you so much for staying with us in this video, and hopefully this will add to your knowledge base some more areas about the internal audit, and it can be useful when you are applying it doing your audit, because proficiency is directly affecting the individuals as well as the overall internal audit activity. So please continue your professional development, keep learning, and if you have any questions, you can give me your feedback in the comment section. I will try to get back to you. Also, please like my video, share my video and subscribe my channels to get more new upcoming exciting videos which I'm planning and working on. So thank you so much.